Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. We are recording this today, Monday, February 12th, of course, the day after the Super Bowl. So that is going to be the plan for today, talking all things NFL and Super Bowl, of course, game points of this, but also some of the aftermath stuff as well. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about this game and the ramifications of it a lot in the coming week. Today we are going to be starting with just the general reactions and points on the game itself. Then in the second segment, we're going to be moving on to a Chiefs-centric conversation, talking about whether or not this officially marks the beginning of the dynasty for the Chiefs. And then in the third segment, we'll talk about what it looks like for this group going forward now. So we will be getting into all of that before finally wrapping up the show, talking some Kyle Shanahan, because he's sort of the big name that's being thrown around, especially with a report that came out earlier today. So we will be talking about Shanahan, his legacy, and all things surrounding that. But before we get into the show today, just a reminder, if you are watching on YouTube, to like and subscribe. Helps us out a lot. And for any of our live viewers here, just a reminder to use the link streaming in the bottom ticker. That is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip for any comments or any considerations. And for anybody tuning in as well, just a reminder to use the live chat to help make this show as interactive as possible. But getting into our first topic here, talking about just reactions to this Chiefs victory. They come out on top, come back from a little bit of an early deficit, and then pull it off with a walk-off touchdown in the waning moments of the overtime period to win 25-22. This was just the second overtime game in Super Bowl history, so a little bit of a monumental feat in that. Interestingly enough, 49ers head coach Kyle Shanahan has now been present in both of these overtime games, with the Falcons-Patriots one coming earlier in the mid-2010s, 2016, I believe it was. And it was the Niners, yet again, in this matchup, coming out on top. I know that they are coming out fast, I should say. Definitely not on top. But, a little bit of a role reversal from what's been going on up to this point in this current playoffs, but similar to the 49ers and Chiefs matchup the last time they faced off in the Super Bowl, where the Niners were able to get off to a bit of a lead. They scored the first 10 points of the game. And no, this wasn't quite as dramatic of some of Mahomes' previous comebacks in terms of making up so much ground in the second half. But this did mark the third Super Bowl where Mahomes has come back while trailing by at least 10. He is yet to lead at halftime at a Super Bowl, and yet he's now 3-1 in the big game. And he, of course, had the two crucial drives at the end of regulation, and then, of course, in overtime to tie the game in regulation, send it to overtime, and then the game-winning drive. And, I thought that it was really interesting this time around, because Mahomes, obviously based off of the talent alone and his now enhanced understanding of the game as well, that him as the quarterback, you don't expect, pretty much at these moments, I think we all knew that he was going to go down the field and score on both these drives, but there was a little part of me that was sort of thinking back to, everybody talks about the scripts, of course, the NFL script, and I thought that it almost would have been a little poetic going back to, and maybe it still is, the fact that they were able to come up here, but going back to NFL opening night where the Chiefs and the Lions played, and it was a similar moment where the Chiefs had an opportunity to score late in the game and continue to make this a game, and their receivers just totally sold Mahomes out. Kadarius Toney, of course, sort of the dialogue surrounding him starting on that opening night. And throughout the regular season, there were a few chances they had to sort of rectify this, and they didn't really. They didn't trail and end up scoring a game-winning drive in regulation under these circumstances all year. And now they are, just the way that this offense came together over the course of the year. And I think that it speaks a lot to the leadership of Patrick Mahomes. And, there was a moment where Marquez Valdes-Scantling late in the game, he had about a 5 or so yard gain after a completion. He breaks the tackle, runs backward, and loses 4 yards. And the very next play, Pat Mahomes goes right back to him because he knows he needs all hands on deck. And he needs to make sure that all of his players are engaged and feeling the best they can. So, not a massive moment in terms of necessarily the results of this game, but I do think that it sort of speaks to Mahomes and his understanding of the game, yes, but also understanding what the game calls for and all of that, but also understanding now all of these emotional and sort of outside of just football alone things that come into the game and come into be a factor, and he's sort of on top of it more now. And maybe this one set of plays is me giving a little too much praise, but I couldn't help but notice that this is just something Mahomes, he obviously voiced a lot of frustration earlier in the year, maybe not directly at his receivers, but he was struggling probably more than we've ever seen him struggle since entering the NFL in terms of, the not even confidence. It was more so confidence in his guys, and he was really feeling sort of the struggles of a little bit of that departure of a true number one receiver, especially when Kelsey wasn't necessarily himself. He was dealing with a little bit of injuries as well, so it wasn't exactly a great sequence in that middle stretch of the season when they were really struggling, but he was able to sort of be the leader he needed to rectify the situation and bring everybody together for, again, almost in a poetic way, coming up in these very similar circumstances to their first game of the year, the first NFL game of the year, in which they came up short. So, I thought that Mahomes was really impressive down the stretch, of course. Now, this is the Chiefs pulling it off and becoming the first repeat champions since the 2003-2004 Patriots, led by, of course, at that time, Tom Brady, which is just sort of another check mark almost. We're going to get into a little bit the Mahomes legacy thing. I still think it comes down to longevity and continued greatness and all of that. But if you are making the argument for Mahomes being the greatest of all time, I think that repeating is something in the NFL that in my entire lifetime, essentially, it hasn't been done. Just that Patriots team where I wasn't even old enough to watch it at the time. So I've always sort of operated under the idea that repeating is just not something that happens in the NFL because of the amount of parity and the amount of roster turnover from coaching staff to players that happens on a year-to-year basis. It's just so hard to maintain that continued success, and led by the greatest quarterback in the league and just about the best coach in the league in Andy Reid, they were able to do so, which was very much a similarity. I think that it is again, just a positive note for this continued building resume for Patrick Mahomes. This was a great game. I know it started out a little bit slow in terms of, maybe the superstar action that we were expecting. We had some turnovers and a little bit unforced turnovers. I mean, they're fumbles. It's obviously a part of the game, but, it just sort of it's not what you expect to see, just such high level play for things to sort of go wrong like that. But, the last 2.5 periods, you can say, considering overtime as well, were incredible. Mahomes led a field goal drive right before the end of the half, and from that point on, it was a one-score game all the way throughout. Now, I know that Kyle Shanahan is going to get a lot of negativity following this game. I'm going to be doing a segment on him myself, but I think that it is really hard to say that anyone in particular choked this game because, again, it was neck and neck the whole time. The 10-point lead for the 49ers was just in the second quarter, so I know people are going to aggregate this and say, oh, well, here's Shanahan blowing another 10-plus point lead in the Super Bowl, even though, again, in the second quarter, I don't think that that really counts. Nobody thought that was insurmountable at any given time. And I just don't think that it can really count towards a slew of blown leads for Shanahan. Now, do I think Shanahan had a great game himself? No, I don't. And we're going to be getting into some of those concerns. But again, I think also just putting it entirely on the shoulders of Shanahan and marking it up as another example of a greater picture. Now, I know it will happen, and it definitely doesn't help his overall legacy, of course, but again, I just sort of hesitate with the full blame there. Now, it was actually special teams, again, a thing where it's kind of hard to really blame anyone in particular. It's almost a cliche at this point, especially over the course of the past few seasons, talking about, well, special teams is the third phase of the game, and everybody sort of looks down on it. It's not supposed to be as important, and yet time and time again, we see how crucial it actually ends up being in these big moments, and it ultimately was the downfall of the 49ers, in my opinion, between the Kansas City Chiefs punt that went off the leg of Luter, I think his name was, on the 49ers, that gave the Chiefs a red zone possession that they scored on the first play out of it on a Mahomes touchdown pass to give them their first lead of the game. And then the other big special teams play was Jake Moody's PAT getting blocked after the Niners scored in the fourth quarter. Now, it's hard to blame him either as far as a choking argument because, I mean, he hit a then Super Bowl record longest field goal in Super Bowl history with a 55-yarder early in the second quarter. Now, Harrison Butker on the other end ended up breaking that, but he also had another 50-yard field goal that the possession after getting blocked on this PAT, and I think that sort of takes guts for a rookie kicker such as Moody, who, wasn't necessarily kicking the best he has all year down the stretch of the year, missed a bad field goal in the Green Bay game, comes out and drills this 53-yarder in a massive moment for them. And, of course, the blocked PAT does allow the Chiefs to tie the game at the end of regulation with a field goal instead of a touchdown. But, again, I think that trying to pin this all on Moody as well, was it a great kick? No. But they also, it felt like, maybe not on this play in particular, but in overtime and in some of these other instances, they were having to lean on him a lot. And I think that, it's just hard when you're putting so much on the kicker. It's because with all the talent on that offense, and obviously the Chiefs defense is great, and we'll be getting more into that as well, but I think that it sort of goes to show, like, the 49ers offense wasn't really able to punch it in the way that they should have. They had 2 opportunities off of turnovers that they were unable to capitalize on. The Chiefs offense, like we mentioned, started out as slow as they did, but the Niners weren't really able to get anything going. Their offensive line, I thought, had a really rough day. They were putting themselves in a lot of third and long situations, the false starts. They really, and again, we'll go more into this in depth during the Shanahan and 49ers segment, but everybody wanted them to run the ball more with Christian McCaffrey. It's like, yeah, just keep running the ball. But Christian McCaffrey had 22 carries, and Elijah Mitchell had a handful of carries himself as well. It's not like they were gouging the Chiefs on the D-line, which I think, goes to show, again, just how good Steve Spagnuolo is, winning his 4th Super Bowl, these 3 with the Chiefs, but he also won with the Giants in the 2010s. But, this is what we talked about on the show all last week, is that Spagnuolo and that defense are going to be prepping for McCaffrey in the run game, because that's where they're most susceptible, and that is the Niners' best weapon, in my opinion. And again, McCaffrey finishes with 80 yards. He finishes with something like 130 plus if you can add in the receiving yards as well. So he was effective, but he wasn't, incredibly efficient, and he was good, and he's a great player. But I thought that the Chiefs defense did a really good job of taking that out. And ultimately, it came down to Patrick Mahomes, as it always sort of seems to do, and him versus another quarterback, and Purdy, who I thought was fine. I thought he was good for most of the night. I don't think it's tough, because I don't know how much he really, if you came into this game thinking that Purdy isn't a franchise guy and he doesn't have enough to lift a team, then you're probably feeling about how you did going into the game. If you were a Purdy defender, you can very easily make an argument that he did just about everything he could have and everything he was asked of. He didn't get a lot of help from his offensive line, and the run game wasn't quite as dominant as it maybe should have been. But again, it's going to be interesting, because I don't think that we really have anything answered when it comes to Purdy, and I think that that's also sort of a bigger point of, it's so hard to just judge a player off of one game, and that's what we always seem to do when it comes to the playoffs, but that's just not really how this whole thing works. So, Purdy's still going to have the same doubters probably going into next year. I think that more importantly for him, he probably has the trust of the front office, not necessarily just based off of this game alone, but just based off of bringing his team to this position and not being the reason for them to lose. But he wasn't the reason that they won. Patrick Mahomes was. And we're talking about the best quarterback in the league, the best quarterback of his generation. So it's not a surprise, but we saw it last year with him versus Hurts. He was just that much better, and the same sort of came into play in this game as well. And it gets really interesting just thinking about this whole big Chiefs picture, where they go from here. And that's what we're going to be getting into in the next segment after we take this quick break. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Continuing on with our Super Bowl talk here, specifically getting more so into, of course, the champion Kansas City Chiefs. This is, of course, as we talked about in the first segment, first repeat champions since the 2003-4 Patriots, and the fourth franchise to ever win 3 Super Bowls in 5 seasons. That list also consists of the Steelers in the mid to late 70s, the Cowboys winning 3 and 4 years from 1992 to 1995, and then the Patriots with the 3 and 4 from 2001 to 2004. The Steelers actually won 4 and 6 years, but again, these are what we look at as the dynasties. Now, I know the Cowboys had a couple other ones in there, same with the Steelers as well. The Patriots is a little interesting because they were more so going 10 years without anything and then coming back around in that mid to late 2010s and rattling off another 3. So it was the total of 6 in that 15-20 year span. But, I think that this does put the Chiefs at a different level of officially becoming a dynasty. In my opinion, I have 3 really being the number. In what exact amount of years, I feel like is a little bit up for debate, but I think that it starts with around a decade. And now I know everybody has different definitions for what it takes to be a dynasty. The Ringer's Bill Simmons, he talks about how for his definition of a dynasty, it usually has to be dominating within the span of about a decade. So again, I'd be curious to his definition whether or not that includes if it's just 3 and 10 or if that's almost not enough, because to me, a dynasty is pure domination in a period of time where you are sort of boxing out, locking out other greats from winning the title. That's what we saw famously, of course, with Michael Jordan and the Bulls, the number of stars that played in that same era in the 80s, and it wasn't until he briefly retired where at least one other great in that era in Hakeem Olajuwon was able to win a couple rings and sort of solidify himself as one of the greatest of all times. But Michael Jordan is literally the reason that we talk about guys like Charles Barkley or those Jazz teams with Malone and Stockton, the Sonics team at the time, and Gary Payton, and all these other, Hall of Fame players, but they weren't able to reach the top of the top because of, and I know that it wasn't just Michael, it was the Bulls dynasty, but, even more so playing to my point, it is a team thing, and that's just the reality of the situation then. Tom Brady held back a bunch of players in his era, and then more recently with the Warriors and these Western Conference teams, some of the greats, the Thunder teams that had the 3-1 lead against them in the Western Conference Finals that they came back from with Russ and KD, and then the really good Rockets teams too with a different couple iterations of Harden and whatever co-star you want to throw in there. The best form of them was with him and Chris Paul. But, that's sort of what a dynasty does, is it pushes down these other groups of all-time great players and all-time great teams to a lower level than them because they are so dominant. And that's what we're currently seeing with Mahomes and the other QBs in the AFC, where we're going to have a little bit of reservations with Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson and whoever else is trying to rival for the, at this point, again, the top quarterback in the league alone is sort of a title that I think Mahomes is going to be holding himself for a long period of time now. But now there's not even really an argument to be made. And not just that, but do these other players have it in them to be a Super Bowl caliber quarterback? It's tougher to prove that you are when you're going up against the generational dynasty that is currently the Kansas City Chiefs. So in my mind, I think it's no doubt, yes, they are. if you think about too the way that they have sort of shaped the NFL, the roster construction, the schematic differences that defenses have sort of adopted over time since Mahomes and the Chiefs have been so dominant. I mean, there was a time period there early in the Chiefs days where they had Tyreek Hill and they would just demolish you with over the top deep plays. You had the speed of Tyreek and the arm of Patrick Mahomes, and it was just deep balls and deep balls and deep balls. And then all of a sudden, other teams started to replicate that. The Bills did so. And as a result, we saw defenses sort of adjust to this new era led by Patrick Mahomes, similar to Curry and the three-point shooting of that Warriors dynasty, where they started playing two safeties back more. And it was forcing teams to more so go methodical drives up the field. And obviously not every team has a Patrick Mahomes to be able to throw it over the top like that. So it maybe didn't apply to every single game, but in a sense it affected every single franchise, because the way that we evaluate prospects now is the ability a lot of the time to have that deep ball, to have some of these Mahomes characteristics. Why do you think Caleb Williams is such a highly touted draft pick? And I'm not saying, it's just there are so many comparisons between him and Mahomes, and I know some people have soured on Caleb Williams a little bit. I was actually at the Super Bowl party I was with just yesterday. It's funny how this is a quick Caleb Williams tangent, and then I will get off it entirely and move on, because I'm sure we'll be doing tons of him over the next couple months. But just the way that people are so out on him because he cried after a game and because he made that comment, lions don't listen to the opinions of sheep or whatever. And, I think that it's all so ridiculous that people are saying he's a guaranteed bust. That's like what I've heard multiple times now. I just think that it's so crazy. But it's not the point. I started talking about him because he has Mahomes characteristics that makes him a very appealing prospect. It's being able to have the arm talent, but also the athleticism outside of the pocket, which is another thing that obviously we've seen Mahomes, especially as time has gone on, sort of rely on his legs less and less. But anytime he needs to pull it, he does. We saw the scramble out that he had. This was in the fourth quarter to pick up a first down. And then the very next play, they ran a read option. Bosa comes flying off the right edge and he pulls it for 22 yards himself. Like, he has this running ability and just overall talent that everybody in the NFL wants to replicate. And, it's just so interesting. I feel like these sort of dynamics that go on across the league as a result of Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs offense doing what they've done. Now, we've since seen the Chiefs sort of similar to the conversation about Mahomes using his legs, but we've seen the Chiefs adjust from they're not just a deep ball threat type of team, and part of that's the maturation of Mahomes in the pocket, being able to put together these drives. And I forget who it was. It was somebody last night, I think, on either NFL Network or on CBS, but somebody has made the point that we have so much internal arguments as football fans about this whole game manager idea and the negative connotations that come to it. But part of what has made Mahomes that much better is the fact that he has been able to sort of develop as a game manager and just take what the defense is giving you. And that's what we saw on the drive for the field goal at the end of regulation. You saw him, the defense was sitting back. I'm just going to pick up chunk play by chunk play, going to his various tight ends and working his way up the field. Then you get Kelsey, who breaks one open, and you can still rely on your arm talent. And the corner throw that he had to, I forget which one of the tight ends it was on the play, it was either Watson or Gray, but it was a great throw. So he still has the arm talent to make these difficult passes, but he's sort of settled into his own also as a just game manager in sorts. Of course, with the ceiling of being that game changer, if we want to get into the terminology that's frequently used here. But I think that in the next segment, we're going to be talking about the Chiefs going forward. So, we'll get more into it as it is, but this is just sort of an example of this is probably just about, and we'll see, obviously, because it requires the Chiefs drafting well and still building up their roster well. They've done a pretty good job up to this point these past couple years, obviously good enough to win back-to-back Super Bowls, but this is probably just about as bad as the receiver situation is going to get for Mahomes and the Chiefs, because we saw them sort of have to take on this different identity this year where it was more defensive based, and they're going to have some decisions to make with that defense, but they were able to rely on that so much more heavily that they were trying to incorporate the run game more, and Pacheco's been very good for them when he can stay healthy. And you have Rice coming along during the course of the season, and I thought that overall he was fine in the Super Bowl, but it's not like they had any players that were really fully changing the game like that. And yes, you have Travis Kelce, who was, again, very quiet first half, but at least was able to, make the big plays in the second half, which is what we see him do. It obviously seemed like it helped some, not that Greenlaw was the primary matchup for Kelce throughout the course of the game, but once it was Greenlaw going down, it was a lot more of that Burks from the 49ers. I'm blanking on his first name right now. But once they got that backup linebacker in, they were looking to attack more, and they were able to take advantage more. So it was Oren Burks for the 49ers. It's just sort of the strategic thing of, Mahomes understanding the matchups and all that. And, I don't know too much about Burks as a player himself, but again, it's just understanding the moment there. And Kelce was able to capitalize on that. He finishes the game with, after I think it was only one catch or something like that in the first half, finishes with 9 catches for 93 yards. And again, it's not like any of the other receiver threats were even really all too impactful for them, but they were good enough. And I think that this is, again, probably one of the worst receiving core groups we'll see with the Kansas City Chiefs under Patrick Mahomes. I think that from here, they're only going to get better. Now, again, that's maybe a big assumption, but I think that, what makes this run so impressive, from when Mahomes first started with the Chiefs to now, is, again, just these different identities that they've been able to be malleable and be able to pick up different things and play different styles that best suits them going forward. And, I think that this was one of the more difficult paths for them during this run, is because it was a little bit less Patrick Mahomes reliant. You can argue it was more because of the lack of surrounding talent, but I felt like this year was a lot more about the defense and sort of having that identity and having Mahomes make the big plays when they need. And I know it didn't go great during some of the regular season, but in the biggest moments, it is the biggest star, Patrick Mahomes, that makes the plays. He's done so in 3, technically they were off last week, but 3 straight playoff games, I should say, as opposed to weeks. And, it's hard as a Patriots fan to sort of root for a guy that is coming for my favorite player's legacy in terms of being the greatest of all time. But, he is just so incredibly fun to watch. And I know that you don't like the Chiefs, they're the villains, but, they are a dynasty now. They are greatness, and other teams should be sort of studying what they do here. I know it's not as easy as just getting a Patrick Mahomes, but I do think that there are other sort of supplemental lessons that you can pick up as far as flexibility and reinventing yourself when need be in the moment that the Chiefs were able to do through these 2 Super Bowls. So we are going to take a break here. When we come back on the other end, we're going to be getting into what is next for the Chiefs. How does this look going forward, more so in depth? So stick with us. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We're just talking some Kansas City Chiefs, the dynasty that they are. Now we are going to be sticking with the Chiefs, but looking more so ahead about what is next to come for the Chiefs. Is the three-peat in play, the just about impossible? This is something where, I've talked about it myself in terms of the significance of a repeat alone. Travis Kelce also during Super Bowl Media Day was really harping on the importance for him of becoming a repeat champion, adding their names to a very refined list in NFL history as far as teams that were able to accomplish back-to-back Super Bowls. And if you had any doubts on whether or not Travis Kelce would be coming back, I think that he sort of gave us a little bit of an insight on it last night, talking about how excited he was for a chance to go out for a three-peat. Now, this has never been done in the Super Bowl era. There were a couple instances in pro football history in the 1920s, 30s. I couldn't even fully get into that, but as far as the NFL's history in the Super Bowl era, it has never been done. And I think that the Chiefs probably have just about as good of a chance as they could ask for. Now, again, it's a lot projecting out to next season already. The Super Bowl literally just happened last night. I'm sure at some point today or tomorrow, we'll get the articles talking about the way too early Super Bowl odds for next season, as I'll actually look it up on the side right now to see if the odds have been posted. It looks like CBS Sports here put out an article this morning where the Chiefs are actually second in odds. They are plus 650 behind the 49ers, but very interesting. I'm sure we'll get all sorts of content about that looking forward. But as far as the Chiefs directly, before worrying about, making the Super Bowl itself first, they're going to have to figure out their offseason. They are in a pretty good position financially. Now, they do have a handful of different players that will be expiring contracts that they're going to have to figure out whether or not they want to re-sign. And now this is where I was sort of talking about. They took on this defensive persona. I don't know if that's really the right way to phrase it, but the identity of having a great defense and controlling the game that way. They are going to be potentially losing some of the starters on defense. They have 7 upcoming free agents that played over 50% of snaps this season. Specifically on that defensive side, it is L'Jarius Sneed, Chris Jones, Willie Gay, Drew Tranquill, and Mike Dana. And then as well, didn't play 50% of the snaps, but Tershawn Wharton was also a pretty impactful player during their playoff run as well. So that's a lot of guys that you are going to have to figure out what you want to do with in the long term. They do have one offensive starter that played over 50% of snaps that will be an expiring contract. That is left tackle Donovan Smith. I'm sure that knowing Mahomes, and to be fair, I don't know all too much about Donovan Smith off the top of my head, but seems like someone they're probably going to prioritize signing to, keep their franchise intact. And by franchise, I mean Patrick Mahomes. But again, they have a good amount of money going into this offseason. They are 13th in the league in projected salary cap space according to PFF, which is pretty solid. They are 4th in the least amount of dead money. So the contracts that they do have on the books, they're at least putting to good use. They aren't dealing with any of these bad contracts that are holding them back as well. Everybody that they're paying, they are pretty much using, which I think is a very big piece. You obviously want to maximize the value of every contract you have on the books. And, it's sometimes can be a little difficult to do so when your quarterback makes up just about a quarter of your cap space as a whole. But they've been able to do a really good job around the edges. Also, again, helps the fact that your quarterback is able to elevate the play of everybody else that he's around with. But this is where it sort of gets interesting into what do you think their priorities are going to be for the upcoming season in the upcoming off season, I should say, of where to address. I feel like there's a lot of receivers in the upcoming draft. I know that the draft a lot of the time can be somewhat of a crapshoot, and you can't fully rely on that, but they got a pretty good amount out of Rashee Rice this season. And again, it's not like he was incredible in the Super Bowl, but he really started rearing his head and becoming a more effective player for this Chiefs team as the season went on. I think that another year of experience is only going to help. You have Travis Kelce, who is going to be 35 next year. He's the third oldest tight end in the league, which just, again, sort of goes to speak to tight ends don't typically have the type of longevity that Travis Kelce's been able to maintain. And I think that to some degree, in comparison to other Hall of Fame tight ends, it has to do with a little bit of the fact he's not so much on the offensive line, maybe taking as many bumps as bruises as other blocking tight ends do more so. And his game, I feel like, is a lot more sort of speed-based than pure physicality. Whereas you saw, the big tight ends like Gronk really get attacked their sort of lower extremities, where Kelce, I just feel like he sort of has the finesse where it's not that he hasn't taken any hard hits over his career, but the finesse with him, I think, is beneficial to the team on the field, and actually the play style helps to keep him going. Now, he was dealing with some injuries this season, and for that reason, we sort of saw a quiet second half of the year for him. So I wouldn't be surprised if that is really the case again. I feel like they probably are going to want to, establish him, and he himself, from a pride perspective, probably doesn't want to sort of be an afterthought for entire seasons at a time. But I think that he probably also has his main focus on winning the Super Bowl again. I think that he has a very good understanding. Weird moment with him last night that kind of got swept under the rug, of him shoving Andy Reid on the play that Isaiah Pacheco fumbled in the red zone. It seemed like he was mad that he wasn't in on the play, but that was very strange to me, just because there really wouldn't have been much of a difference. And obviously, Super Bowl, heat of the moment, you got a lot of emotions going on, but a potentially dangerous play for one of the oldest coaches in the NFL. And ultimately, again, it's not a big deal. I myself don't want to blow it out of proportion, but that was a very strange thing that went on, that we came out of timeout and the CBS crew was like, whoa, look at this, and then we just never heard anything about it for the rest of the game. I'm sure Kelce and or Andy Reid will touch on it at some point in the coming interviews for them, but I think that Kelsey probably can just be their anchor a little bit. He probably doesn't have the legs under him necessarily to be the full workhorse that he was, but that's why if they can do a better job of putting the other pieces around, at least for regular season. I mean, I think that the Chiefs got the criticism they deserved during the course of the regular season, leading the league in drops, leading the league in penalties. I believe their offensive line did just a lot of stupid stuff with this Chiefs team, but they obviously were able to come around in the end, which is great for them. Great, they won the Super Bowl. But I do still think these are things that they should be looking to address. Now, like I mentioned, the receiver class in this upcoming draft is very talented. There are more than enough weapons that you could potentially address there. I'm curious how much they're going to look at that defense, because this isn't really a bad position. I know that, again, definitely have to address some of those things on the offensive side in the coming year, but they were able to get it done in the end because they have Patrick Mahomes. And, draft capital alone, again, I think is one thing, but it's also a little bit hard to rely on that much youth. And, I don't want to bring it up right now, but like if you look at the Ravens, so I know they have some whole other issue going on with him, but Zay Flowers, it really felt like the lack of experience there and the lack of maturity sort of led to some of the on-field decisions, the taunting, the diving for the goal line, and the fumble. It can be difficult putting these young kids who have had so much success in their lives to sort of take a little bit of a back seat in these big moments. And the Chiefs have been able to do it with the leadership of Kelsey and of Mahomes, but how much do you really want to put into that? I do think that it's interesting if you go back, because I was looking back on, I think the hardest adjustment was transitioning from Tyreek Hill to whatever else they were going to get. They understood the importance of Kelsey. They understood how much money they were going to be coughing up to him and to Mahomes, that they didn't really have the financials to go and pay him as well. So they end up trading him for a variety of different picks. They get Trent McDuffie. They, package some of these picks to trade with the Patriots, in which out of that deal, they get Trent McDuffie, an all-pro cornerback, and they get Sky Moore, who was, kind of quiet this year, but helped contribute to their Super Bowl last year, I would argue. And then they also used some of those picks to trade for Kadarius Toney as well, who was a healthy scratch and a little bit of a disaster this season. But people forget that Toney was impactful in that Super Bowl. He scored a touchdown. He had a big punt return. And, there's plenty of talent there for him. I'm not going to talk too much about him right now. I don't want to be too negative on him because I think that there's a chance that he could see some sort of a career revival. I just don't think that the Chiefs is going to be the place for that. But that being said, ended up being a decent usage of the pick. Maybe they could have gotten someone that was a little more reliable for them, but again, he did what he needed to in the biggest moment to help them win last year. So you really, in my opinion, can't criticize them too heavily over that move alone. So again, they're going to have this cap space, and they're going to have defensive pieces probably on the move. Chris Jones, if you remember, now it seems like forever ago, but he actually missed their first game of the year with a holdout situation because he wanted a contract. He ended up getting 10 plus million to tie him over for the rest of this season, but I'm still curious whether or not Kansas City and him are going to see eye to eye on bringing him back. I honestly feel like he could probably be on his way now. He's been the defensive centerpiece, really, for the past two Super Bowls. He was incredible again yesterday in the big game. So, he's going to get paid this offseason. And going the franchise tag route and just trying to play that game again, I feel like the Chiefs can probably put their money and attention towards other things. While I do think that Chris Jones is a monster, I think it may be time for them to part ways. Now, I'm very interested in L'Jarius Sneed and their linebackers here, because Sneed, yes, they drafted McDuffie, and he has been phenomenal for them, but McDuffie is a little bit more of a slot corner than an outside guy like Sneed. Sneed has been really good. Didn't necessarily put together his best performance, I don't think, yesterday, but I mean, still, he is an all-pro guy himself and is extremely talented. So, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see the way they pick and choose going forward, but I do think that the Chiefs have a lot of potential to run this thing back, not just off of the Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid, Travis Kelce combination there, but I think that they have the money, that they're not in quite as much of a hole as a team like the 49ers, and they can sort of retool in various ways. Now, it's going to take hitting on some guys that might not be quite as easy, and we'll see, but I think that it is very much in play for them at the moment. I think that them being second in Super Bowl odds is pretty much accurate. Interesting that the 49ers are first, though, considering they are not in quite as good of a situation when it comes to salary cap. So we will be getting into them, be getting into Kyle Shanahan, their head coach, when we come back for our final segment. So stick with us. We will be back with the final segment just after this. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We are wrapping up the show here. It's been all Super Bowl talk today. We talked the game itself. We talked some Chiefs. Now we're going to be talking a little bit about the losing side here in the 49ers, who, suffer at the hands of another very successful season and yet can't get it done once again. It's obviously led by their head coach, Kyle Shanahan, who has a little bit of doubt that is just following him around at this point. A quick recap, because we've been over it plenty of times. He was with the Falcons when they blew the 28-3 game against the Patriots in the Super Bowl in 2016. He was a part of the 49ers team that blew the 20-10 lead in the fourth quarter against the Chiefs the last time these two teams met up in 2019, I believe it was, and allowed 21 straight points to get shut out down the stretch in that game and lose that. I think that Shanahan as a whole, we obviously know him for his offensive mind and the system that he's able to put into place. And while that is great, we see some lapses with him with being able to come up in these big moments. And I think sort of the bigger issue at hand is some of the decision-making things for him. The big one that came out of this game was the decision to receive the ball in overtime. And it becomes an even bigger story because as of this morning, we got a few stories from a few different outlets talking about how there were 49ers players that were unaware of the rule change in overtime, whereas the Chiefs players were made extremely aware of it, and they reviewed it frequently. So when this was happening in real time, I thought that the initial decision for them to receive it was maybe to, I wouldn't say protect, but to just get Purdy in his zone, get him to do his thing, not worry about any external factors about what number of points you need to score to keep the game alive or to win. I thought it was sort of trying to simplify that. And I didn't think it was a terrible decision at the time, but as this went on, you could sort of see as it was playing out that they were in for a little bit of trouble. Now, it almost went completely sideways for them when Purdy almost threw an interception on the first play of the game. Bolton just wasn't able to get both of his hands under it, but he makes a little bit of a risky throw over the middle. Bolton has a good play, but just can't quite hang on to it. And then after a false start penalty, they were put in a 3rd and long situation and sort of got bailed out from a defensive holding call against the Chiefs. It was definitely the right call, but automatic first down there, and that sort of helped get them going. But even then, they drive down the field, but we just saw this offense with a little bit of a lack of ability to finish these drives for a lot of the game. We saw in the fourth quarter when they went for it on 4th and 3. They go out to Kittle, who gets the first down yardage. That ultimately sets up the Juwan Jennings touchdown. So that was a huge play, but all in all, I really didn't think that they were all that effective. I mean, they had to settle for multiple 50-yard field goal attempts, relying on, again, Jake Moody, who I don't think was really the villain for 49ers fans because of that missed kick. I think that he did just about everything they asked of him and a little bit more. Yes, the PAT ends up getting blocked, but again, you were leaving it in sort of field goal range-ish when you aren't able to finish off these drives, and you have to end up settling for field goals. So, it's kind of tough here. It's not like the offense was bad, and I thought Brock Purdy as a whole was solid. Again, he had that Bolton play where he was almost intercepted, and he had another throw earlier in the game that I thought could have been picked off as well. But, I think that all in all, it was just a little bit of a disappointing offensive performance, and obviously, the level of talent that is on that Chiefs defensive side of the ball. So, they finished, the Chiefs defense, I believe, they finished allowing less than 16 points per game in this playoff run. So obviously really impressive stuff there. The Chiefs, or the 49ers, that is, put up, the Bills might have had more than them, but a, very respectable performance, but obviously not enough. And I think that it's really interesting just the way that if you look at the decision to receive the ball, Shanahan after the game talked about he wanted to have the ball third if both teams scored with a chance to win it in a sudden death situation. But I feel like that's planning ahead a little bit too much. Maybe just focus on one drive at a time. That doesn't really make sense to me. And it is also interesting just to note that Shanahan is the only person in NFL history to be involved in both the Falcons-Patriots overtime Super Bowl and this one, the only 2 overtime Super Bowl games in the history of the NFL. And he played in that other one before the rules were different. And it's interesting how multiple guys on the 49ers talked about how they weren't aware of the changes to the rules. And no, it didn't really have an effect because one way or another, even if it were the old rules, the Niners kicked a field goal, the Chiefs would have been given another possession, and they would have had a chance to win it on a walk-off touchdown like they did. But I don't know. I mean, Kyle Juszczyk and Eric Armstead both talked about it after the game. makes you think that maybe if the players were more aware of it, there could have been more heads involved in the understanding of what this moment means, and maybe they have somebody in that locker room that can sort of speak up and say, hey, are we sure about this? And just sort of talk it out more. Meanwhile, the Chiefs side of this, they were talking about it all year, supposedly. Drew Tranquill and Justin Reed and Chris Jones all talked about how it was a regular conversation for them throughout the playoffs, and it was even stated during training camp that this was a rule. They should be prepared for it. And really, I think that word prepared is kind of the big thing in all of this, because Shanahan just sort of had a lapse in helping his team to be prepared and to understand what you're preparing for, this big game, your entire season on the line. Just a little bit of a lack of doing your job. If you're Shanahan, you want to have your guys know the moment, know what you need to do, and he failed to do that. And yes, this was the first instance of the rules coming into play in the playoffs in overtime, but it's been a rule for a couple years. There was a ton of conversation about it when the rule was changing, dating back to the 2018 AFC Championship game, where people were mad that this was not a rule, and then the 13 seconds game between the Chiefs and the Bills, where everybody thought it was unfair again when the Bills didn't get a chance to touch the ball in overtime. So, this was a conversation. This has been a conversation across the league for years, and Kyle Shanahan, despite being in an overtime Super Bowl game, a handful of years before, didn't really have the thought to, clue his team in on it. I don't know if maybe it was something he just thought to take for granted that everybody would know. And again, this conversation is slightly blown out of proportion, because ultimately it wouldn't have really had an effect the way that the game had played out based off of them kicking a field goal. The Chiefs end up scoring the touchdown, but it's malpractice, I feel like, for Shanahan to not key his guys in, because I feel like somebody in that locker room would have understood the importance. I mean, they all played college football, and that's like a big rule in college football is you want to know what you have to score, because you can control the game a little bit more. Where, Chris Jones talked about it after the game as well, that the Chiefs were prepared to go for two if they had the 49ers scored on their first overtime drive, but they didn't. And again, that's just like, it's one of those things where it would have been fascinating if we got to that moment, but it's an advantage you do have to know how many points. You essentially have a fourth down when you need to, and you can just call your plays differently too down the stretch. And I don't necessarily disagree with Shanahan like other people do about the decision to kick the field goal. I mean, it's tough. It really is tough, because on one hand, it's doable. You're inside the Chiefs' 10-yard line, so you do have them backed up, but it also, they had already converted on a 4th and 3 earlier in the game on that fourth quarter touchdown drive. This one's slightly longer, and I don't know. After the game Harrison Butker was hitting the 57-yarder, I feel like it's really tough to go out on a made field goal like that, where essentially half of the field is his field goal range. And you want to have a little bit more faith in your defense that you can keep them out of the end zone versus getting pushed back, 30, 40 yards. But a lot of controversy around Shanahan. And I think that that's just inherently also about sort of who Shanahan is at this point, the very successful coach. But there's a pattern forming here about the lack of coming up in the biggest possible moments. I didn't even think his play calling was bad necessarily. A lot of people were upset that they didn't run the ball more, but there was that stretch early in the second half where they went 3 and out on their first 2 possessions, running 6 plays and 6 passes. But McCaffrey did finish with 22 yards. He had 30 total touches, and on the ground, it was only 3.6 yards per carry. Not a bad mark, but it wasn't, like they were running down the throats of the Chiefs here. And, I think that it really just comes down to them not capitalizing on these drives. And you can call it play calling. You could call it the offensive line. I mean, there was pressure on Purdy a lot, and he made some throws in pressure. But I also don't think that, he wasn't really running as much as we saw in the second half against Detroit. That really added this extra element to their offense. And, I think that it's just whoever you had the negative feeling about, you can blame. I don't think there's any sole responsibility. The players just didn't necessarily come up just enough, but Shanahan could have done things differently as well, which is a little bit of a cop-out thing of me to say. But, I think that all in all, this game was more so just about the Chiefs being better. And it was a great game. This was a classic Super Bowl for us. We get another overtime Super Bowl, and we have the theatrics of the comeback and, going back and forth a little bit down the stretch. It was a lot of fun. And sort of to what I talked about in the first segment, I don't think that it was anybody really choking, but there were obviously things that both teams could have done better. And we are choosing to look at them more because it's the 49ers and because they lost. I think that a very interesting sort of thing that happened, but won't get any talk whatsoever because the Chiefs won, is on the Chiefs' field goal drive to send the game to overtime right at the end of regulation. Mahomes had a pretty bad sequence, honestly, where he tries to scramble up, he gains a few yards, but he is tackled. He then brings everybody back to the line. Pacheco's 15-20 yards down the field, so he has to run back, get set, and they choose not to spike it. They run an actual play, but nothing's there, so he hangs in there for a few seconds and then just throws it away. That ends up chewing about 15-ish seconds off of the clock, and had circumstances been different, then they get the Kelsey play that takes them all the way upfield inside the 10-yard line. They get minimum one more shot at the end zone had they had those extra 15 seconds. I mean, I don't know if they actually even ended up using their timeout late in the game like that. They had one at the time. I know they were holding on to it, and I don't know if they used it to even stop the clock. I think it was more so, if they did even use it, it was just to strategize. But again, you sort of cost yourself a big-time shot at ending the game right there. And again, we always look at the results of how things played out versus how they could have played out, which is the right thing to do, of course. But it's just interesting. Kyle Shanahan is going to get the scrutiny because he's in the losing position in this one. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a bummer for his sake. I think he's a great coach, and I think that he catches a lot of negativity because of being in the position with a premier franchise and not being able to get the job done just yet. The 49ers championship drought extends another year. They haven't won since 1995, and the pressure is going to be surrounding him going forward. It's curious, they are actually currently, according to PFF, in the red in terms of projected salary cap, but they're going to have decisions to make. They're still going to have a very talented team, but it's going to be interesting how they move forward from here, and specifically Kyle Shanahan. You'd like to think that you don't make that mistake twice as far as the overtime rule in the playoffs, and specifically, again, the lack of having your team prepared. But, only time will tell, really. So that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you listen to us / watch us, and we will be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So I'm TJ Mabarty, and thanks for tuning in.